Hello and welcome to the DecisionWise Engaging People podcast. My name is Charles Rogel. I'll be moderating our discussion today. Today I'm joined by Spencer Taylor.
Hi, Charles.
And Kenna Bryan.
Hi, Charles.
Spencer is a consultant here at DecisionWise. Kenna is also an assessment consultant. And today we're going to be talking about the role of tools and resources in employee engagement. Spencer, you want to kick us off and introduce our topic today?
Absolutely. It's been a really fun discussion leading up to our today's podcast. We've kind of come up with a scenario for the listener to consider. So you're sitting at your desk, working away, you're happy as a lark, when suddenly you feel a pressure in your chest unlike anything you've experienced before. You find yourself gasping for air, but you can't seem to get enough, and you begin to panic. Everything starts to go dark. A few minutes later, you find yourself in an ambulance on the way to the hospital. After stabilizing at the hospital, a doctor comes into your room and explains that your left lung collapsed while you were sitting at your desk. So as terrifying as this would be, ask yourself, prior to this moment of this horrendous experience, how often did you stop at random intervals on an average day and think, I sure do appreciate my left lung. That thing just gets the job done every time I inhale. After this moment, after having lived for just a few minutes, if this actually happened to you, and you had no use of your left lung, how often do you think you would think about how grateful you are for that lung? Probably more than once a day, at least for the next little while. So it's kind of a chance to think about the parallel between overall the idea behind tools and resources in an organization. We tend to not notice them until they're taken away, until they stop working or they're completely removed from the equation. The absence of the right tools to get the work done efficiently in the way that each individual feels is best often becomes a true emergency and significantly takes away from our ability to perform our assigned tasks. So whenever we bring up the topic, our minds go toward the basics, like a computer that works at a decent pace. Microphones that we're using right now, it's a tool for our podcast. If we didn't have these, we would have a bunch of static or silence for the podcast itself. So if they were removed from the equation, it takes away our complete ability to produce a podcast. So
Well, it's always fun when the internet goes down and everyone can leave early, you know?
Yeah, there's an important tool.
All right.
Yep. In fact, just recently I watched a movie from the 90s. It's called Deep Impact. And in the very beginning scenes of that, there's this junior astronomer. He's like a high school student or something, and he is looking up into the stars with his friend, and they find this star that they're arguing about whether it's a certain star. And they send the picture into the chief astronomer at the laboratory with the big telescope on the top of the mountain, and they find out that it's actually a comet that's heading for Earth, and it's going to destroy the planet. So up to this point in the scene that I'm thinking of, the astronomer's like, he grabs a piece of pizza and he's kind of kicked back and he's just doing his thing. And then he immediately realizes that this could be a catastrophic event because the computer has told him, again, this is the 90s, so it's like taking a minute, right? To calculate it. But it's told him there could be this cataclysmic event. And suddenly he needs an internet connection. So he has to dial in and he's not able to connect to the internet. And so he gets in his Jeep and puts it on a floppy disk, one of the old 3.5 disks of this data point that he needs to get to the national security people or whatever. And he ends up getting a crash and doesn't make it. Anyway, so the absence of an internet connection can potentially lead to a world-ending comet hitting the Earth. Yeah. So anyway.
I love it.
I love that example. I actually have some data to back that up. So here at DecisionWise, our standard employee engagement survey contains some questions regarding employee satisfaction and others regarding employee engagement. Tools and resources is one of those satisfaction elements that must be in place before companies can start thinking about engagement. But we found that tools and resources, though, also transfers and correlates with engagement. Our research actually found that a low score on the survey item stating I have the tools and resources I need to do my job well is actually a negative driver of engagement. So if you're wondering where you kind of fall on that, here's some percentage points for you. So the survey item that says I have the tools and resources I need to do my job well, 76% of employees agree or strongly agree to this statement across all industries. There are some industries that do especially well. Those include finance and insurance and transportation and warehousing, both at 79%, and then utility companies at 82%. And then there are some industries that score a little bit lower, including manufacturing and food services, both at 72%, and then public administration at just 67%.
I think that's good news overall, right?
Yeah.
We talk about how this doesn't tend to show up in the bottom of the survey. Sometimes it's not in the top, but it's not one of those things a lot of organizations struggle with, because if it's like we illustrated at the beginning, if it's absent, we tend to notice it immediately and want to go solve that.
Mm-hmm.
I had an experience that kind of fit into that more urgent category that I think illustrates that tools and resources have to go beyond just the technology piece. You can't. In my experience, I worked for a larger university as a course developer earlier in my career, and my first day I was given a nice laptop and a cubicle, and basically I was told, good luck, figure it out. And that's what I did for a few months. I would have to just turn to my neighbors who were in a similar role and be like, hey, how do we log into this system? And how do we just figure it out as you go? Yeah. It was initially pretty stressful, but there was one little funny story I'll share briefly. The gal who sat across the cubicle wall from me, her name was Laura, and I never found a way to ask her a question without making her jump out of her skin. Like, I could tap on the wall and she would jump out of her skin. I could go way back from my desk and be like, Laura, and she would jump out of her skin. And I would go around the corner and try to approach her where she can see me coming. And anyway, so it seems like a tangent, but it actually applies, I think, in the sense that I took away her ability to use her tools and resources effectively because I kept interrupting her with my own questions because of the absence of tools and resources on my end. So, so it can snowball pretty quickly when one person is missing a certain tool or resource, because people in general are resourceful and they're going to figure it out, but that often is to the detriment of someone else's ability to be productive.
Yeah, and I've seen this more kind of localized in organizations. So most employees agree with the statement, but then when you dive into different departments or locations, you'll see variations in results from this question. It could be technology. I know we worked with one client where they did, they're in waste management, specifically for servicing porta potties. And the drivers that had the new nice trucks scored really high, but if you had an old truck, you were scoring low. And so they were rolling out a new fleet of vehicles and trucks for their drivers. But if you were kind of lower on the totem pole or last on the list, you rated that question lower.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Shows the relativity of perceived tool or resource.
Mm-hmm. If someone's got a nice shiny truck, I got to drive the old one.
You feel picked on all of a sudden.
Right.
Yeah. I think something else that's interesting as we've talked about tools and resources in the discussion leading up to this podcast is that we found that no one element of the work experience is completely isolated. There are overlaps, and for example, we've seen tools and resources often connects with the engagement factor of autonomy. And I was thinking about a few companies that I've heard stories about that have those tools and resources and have given their employees autonomy. So I wanted to give a few examples. So the Ritz-Carlton, famous for their customer service stories, they have a large discretionary budget for each employee. In fact, it's $2,000 per employee per guest that their employees can use to spend to help improve the customer experience. Spencer, did you have a story about the Ritz-Carlton that you had heard about?
Yeah, absolutely. I love them as a shining example of an organization that does it right. Again, I'm grateful that you brought up the autonomy because it does highlight that no element of satisfaction or engagement that we tend to talk about and measure stands by itself. There's always some type of intersection. And the one that I had thought about was there was a bartender that worked at the Ritz-Carlton, and he overheard an older couple who was enjoying dinner in the bar talk about their disappointment of not being able to enjoy the following evening's meal on the beach because the husband was in a wheelchair. And so he used his discretionary fund to arrange a temporary ramp be built over the sand to get this gentleman out to the sand to have a nice dinner with his spouse. So something really small. Yeah. Most organizations would just be like, well, that's not my problem or whatever. It just tends to be the way of thinking about that. It's totally outside the lane of a bartender to go do that. And yet, I'm sure when they wanted to come back, they didn't hesitate to stay at that location because of the great experience.
Oh, for sure. It's amazing what that autonomy and the right tools and resources can do. Another example is the grocery store chain Trader Joe's. Their employees can open any product to allow their customers to try. If the customers are unsure if they want to buy it or not, they're allowed to open the product. And there are multiple customer service stories of Trader Joe's. One of my favorites is about an elderly man in Pennsylvania, and he was snowed in. And his daughter was concerned that he wouldn't have enough food to make it through because nobody knew when the snow was going to stop. And so she called the local Trader Joe's and had tried with, to no avail to find any grocery deliveries in the area. And Trader Joe's does not normally deliver groceries, but in this instance, they packed up a bunch of groceries and found a way to deliver these groceries to that snowed-in elderly man. And awesome example of that. And then the last one is Zappos. Their employees have the freedom to send thank you cards, gift baskets, get well soon flowers. On a phone call, if their employees hear a baby crying, there's been examples of them sending baby blankets and shoes. And so just incredible what the right kind of autonomy as a tool and resource can do.
Terrific. I love that. And I was just thinking of another example. Sometimes a resource, and this may be a little bit of a stretch, I don't know, we'll see, but is a policy. Like I know an organization I've worked with recently changed their time off policy to have unlimited time off. And yet the way they're policing that has made it so it's really not unlimited, and there's some scrutiny behind whether it's being used properly and some of this. So I think it just shows that we can come up with a resource that's intangible, like a new policy that has really good intent behind it, but the communication around that, again, this is one of those places that intersects with much more than just the tool or resource or policy itself, and allows us to either have a really healthy environment where you have autonomy to flex and spend and utilize things to the benefit of the customer that gets to be told on a podcast somewhere. I mean, eventually that's pretty cool, right? That these organizations you've shared have done this enough that it has permeated widely, and people probably have heard about some of the similar stories from these specific organizations who have done it right. So anyway, I just think it's interesting to try to build off of that, whether it's a smaller organization or a global company like some of these that you've talked about.
No, definitely. So I think that, as you listeners are thinking about your employees and your companies, there's a few questions to consider. So you might consider, what tools and resources do your employees need? Or what tools and resources could help your employees do their job well? And then thinking about your employees, do your employees feel like they have the tools and resources they need?
Great. I love that. And again, it's I think it's important too to acknowledge that in asking, there's an implicit commitment to fix it if the answer is no, I don't, or the tools and resources I have are insufficient. The organization itself is saying, hey, we're gonna make that right. So that's important. And then I think with all that we've talked about up to this point, as we get toward the end here, thinking through some potential action steps. Again, if you're a leader in any type of management role, listening to this, you're thinking through, okay, what's the so what factor? Where do I go from here? Some possible actions. The first one we came up with was to actively evaluate how well tools and resources are working. Again, partially by just coming out and asking the question. Human nature is to settle into a comfort zone and continue to use an old tool just because it's comfortable. It's been the standard for many years. For example, if I just loved Windows 95 or Windows 98 and I was still trying to use that just because I loved it, I would basically not be able to do my job because it just doesn't work anymore. So being active in pursuing better tools.
It's interesting. To add to that, I've seen millennials especially are very open to adopt new technologies and want to use new technologies, and just thinking of the adaptation of new tools like Teams or Slack or something like that. Normally the manager's somewhat resistant to it, but the younger generation is used to using it and finds it as a great collaborative device. And so as a manager, you have to be willing to kind of flex a bit in terms of what your people find most efficient in terms of working together, and adopt new technologies as well. Don't get stuck in your Windows 95 mentality and let your employees suffer.
I like that. Yep.
No, I love that. That actually goes right along with our next action step we came up with, is to actually assign someone to be the custodian almost of a specific tool that would be essential for the job. And like Charles was saying, this is especially important for technology-based tools. So you could invite that custodian to keep an eye on the industry for that tool, and then formally evaluate whether the tool is the best, at least every 6 months, perhaps even quarterly, and keep a track on those trends.
Another point, as far as the overall employee experience, a place where there's overlap is thinking about onboarding programs. Again, back to my experience of just being given basically a computer and a cubicle, giving more than just that, thinking through the tools and resources someone has provided in their initial days and weeks that extends beyond just the tangible, obvious tools. And that can include the tool of good relationships and some of these other things that represent additional points of intersection with other aspects of employee satisfaction and overall engagement. So I think it's important to evaluate holistically the experience new employees are having, because you want them to be ambassadors for your brand, whether you're a nonprofit, a huge corporation, something in between. It's important to have complete buy-in from your people, and giving them the right tools is vital to that.
Absolutely.
To wrap up, what final words would you like to add, Spencer?
Yeah, we touched on this briefly earlier, but tools and resources is one of those areas that it's really easy to overlook, because it's not as exciting as talking about, or it doesn't feel as powerful necessarily as talking about some of these hotter topics like diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's something a lot of our clients are talking about in today's environment, and it's important to talk about it. Emotional intelligence, overall engagement, these tend to be kind of spicier, so to speak, like they're just more interesting. Topics we're passionate about here at DecisionWise, each of these, including tools and resources. We've tried to illustrate in the last few minutes that this element, this tools and resources component of employee satisfaction, and even where it integrates with some of the engagement pieces, it must be addressed in order to lay a groundwork for a very highly engaged, highly productive team, and ultimately creating that optimal employee experience.
That's a great point. One thing I'll add is, as a manager, one of your responsibilities is to help support your team and help them to feel like you have their back and you're kind of fighting for the tools and resources that they need. And so, as you're doing that, remind them, or at least show them that how, the past 6 months we've made these updates or made these changes or these improvements. So they see that, this is a place that's kind of thriving and progressing, as opposed to just being stuck with the same old things year after year.
I think that's a great point, Charles. And I think for me, it brought back this story you shared about the trucks. Just communicating how a certain tool will be rolled out. And here's the criteria of who gets a new truck and who doesn't yet, or whatever. I mean, again, that's a point of intersection with one of the bigger challenges organizations face, which is communication top down and communication across departments. The subject of that communication could be the tool or resource. And so again, another point where it's this holistic series of components that tie into the overall experience.
Definitely. Kenna, anything you want to add?
Yeah. I think just in summary, Charles, you can't really build a good home on a bad foundation. And I would submit that you can't really build an engaged employee workforce without good employee satisfaction elements like tools and resources that we've talked about.
Excellent. Well, everyone, thanks for joining us today. We look forward to having you join us on a future podcast. And thanks, Spencer and Kenna, for your input today.
Thank you,
Thanks, Charles.